Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Focal Points. Today is a very special day. The CDC has officially reversed its stance on vaccines and autism after about 30 years. And today we have Dr. Peter McCullough, president of McCullough Foundation, and John Leake, vice president of the McCullough Foundation. And we're going to talk all about this, what it means, and why it happened. So, John, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I think that our starting point, and I think all of us can agree on this, it really began during the COVID-19 pandemic, the extremely aggressive rollout of this new genetic technology, the so-called messenger RNA gene therapy shots, with Pfizer and Moderna being the two much touted candidates. And we perceived that this is so aggressive, this is so fanatic, they're just fanatical, there just doesn't seem to be any kind of cautionary principles being applied to this. And what we observed is the great heresy that we are having to contend with in terms of accusations is that anything that promotes vaccine hesitation. And I think, Dr. McCullough, you got a huge dose of this in your efforts to find early treatment modalities. You think you're just helping your patients, but you're immediately sort of slammed and smeared and sued and the rest of it. And I remember when you began to think the heresy that I am apparently guilty of is promoting vaccine hesitation. And so we got into this arena. What is vaccine hesitation? Has been deemed by our public health authorities to be the great anathema to public health. Vaccine hesitancy could be any idea, any notion, any perception that causes someone to hesitate to get a shot. So we began looking at this strange world through the lens of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout. But then the further we got into it, the more we began to think, well, this isn't just the COVID-19 vaccines. It seems to be the entire vaccine enterprise going back 300 years. So we ended up writing a book about this, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. It was a New York Times bestseller in August. But parallel to writing the book, and Dr. McCullough, I'll let you talk about this, a very thoughtful, observant philanthropist said, hey guys, have you all thought about really looking deeply into a full review of just what in the devil is causing this explosive rise of autism? And Doctor, you were the one that originally started kind of piecing this endeavor together. So maybe you could tell us, what were your thoughts as we got into this study?
Sure. Well, thank you, John. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, president of McCullough Foundation, and it certainly is a big day for our foundation. When I was a kid, autism was 1 in 10,000. The CDC estimates as of 2022 is 1 in 31, 3.2% of the entire nation's childhood population carries this diagnosis. And there's related diagnoses. There's over 10% have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are percents that have tics and seizures. All of these markedly on the rise since 1986 when the Vaccine Injury Compensation Act legislation was put in place, which provided immunity to liability lawsuits for the vaccine manufacturers. And we saw a proliferation of vaccines enter the schedule. Children were taking more and more of these. And when we looked back at our Health and Human Services, which according to this legislation, John, should be giving biannual reports to Congress on vaccine safety, they haven't delivered a single report. So the concern is, as the autism epidemic really has gotten into full swing, and now I see autistic individuals in my practice routinely, we see them out in everyday life, this has now become a mainstay diagnosis. 27% of those affected children have profound autism. That is, they very markedly low IQ. They can't communicate, nonverbal or screaming, head banging behaviors, unable to use the toilet themselves alone, lifelong disability. So as we saw this evolving, we saw it and obtained independent funding, and we set out to do a systematic review. It hadn't been done actually in many, many years. And we came up with our findings that we presented by a press release, as well as put on the European Commission preprint server on October 27th, 2025. So this is really recent. Nick, why don't you take us through the statements that the CDC has relied upon that they put on the website? Take us through what the CDC said the party line was up until the McCullough Foundation report.
Yeah, so before the CDC on their own webpage literally had this page we're looking at right here, but they said without a doubt that vaccines do not cause autism. So they basically had a indefensible fraudulent claim that was not supported by any evidence. And so that was there for many, many, many years until yesterday when they decided to finally reverse course and act upon the actual totality of evidence. And so now on the CDC Autism and Vaccines website, they have 3 key points. One is they say the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based claim because studies have not ruled out the possibility that infant vaccines cause autism. And then they went on to say studies supporting a link have been ignored by health authorities. And so both of those are true. And we demonstrate this without a doubt in our McCullough Foundation Autism Report, where it is literally just a small, narrow band of vaccines that have ever been studied for autism or other neurodevelopmental disorders. It's really only been the MMR and to a small extent hepatitis B. And so, yeah, they cannot make that claim. They simply cannot. And so studies supporting the link have been ignored. Well, yeah, we identified 107 studies that infer a possible association with vaccines and autism or other neurodevelopmental disorders. They never once brought those up, never once mentioned those. And if you look on the right side of this figure here on the screen, you'll see all of the major reports that have come out since the 90s. First, it was the Institute of Medicine, where they say the evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between vaccines and autism, right? So they've said they can't rule out a link, even in these major reports that are widely cited as so-called debunking a link. And then you move on to the HHS, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They had 2 reports, one in 2014, one in 2021. And in both of these, they conclude that there was no evidence to reject a causal relationship between vaccines and autism. And so each of these times, there was no ability to claim vaccines do not cause autism. And now, at the bottom, you'll see in 2025, the McCullough Foundation report, Determinants of Autism Spectrum Disorder, puts without a doubt that vaccination is indeed the most significant modifiable risk factor for autism.
So, Nick, the CDC was relying on the Institute of Medicine as well as AHRQ in their release on the internet yesterday, November 19th, 2025. And I think the important point, John, is that, we have this gap from 2021 up to 2025. And what's happened in that gap is this examination now of far beyond the COVID-19 vaccines, the entire vaccine enterprise. So what have we learned?
Well, what we've learned is that, for example, this long-standing assertion, vaccines don't cause autism. This has been repeated ad nauseum like a mantra on television. Sanjay Gupta has been fond of repeating this again and again on his CNN medical show. And the most remarkable feature of this assertion that is made without evidence is that it's also made with the acknowledgement. I actually have a recording of Dr. Gupta saying, we don't know what causes autism. We just know that it's not caused by vaccines. Now, I think, and I would argue that is a fallacy. If you don't know what causes it, how precisely have you gone about ruling out the possibility that vaccines are at least a causal factor? And I want to mention the way in which, in our world of mass media and electronic representations of reality, I think there is a long documented history of powerful institutions and commercial interests simply making assertions. It's as though it's an article of faith. It's as though it's a religious institution that has simply handed down an orthodoxy without any underlying evidence or explanation of how this conclusion or this assertion came about. And if that assertion is made enough times in enough media, then it just sort of becomes in the minds of the public a perceived incontrovertible truth. So what we've done is we've gone back, and I think to our surprise, I think you gentlemen would agree with me. I mean, the evidence is actually there. It's in dozens of studies. The whole exercise reminded me of the observation of a famous linguistic philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein, who pointed out that in a lot of these intellectual controversies, the answers are already there. The solutions are already there. We don't need new information. We just need to examine in an impartial way the information that is already at hand. And that's what we've done with our report. And it's very gratifying to see that just 3 weeks later, the CDC is acknowledging or recognizing the basic findings of our report.
Well, certainly the CDC, HHS, all the officials were sent our report on October 27, 2025. I was in communication with Senator Ron Johnson, and clearly there had been thought leaders in this field for decades who had these suspicions. There's been about 36 books written about vaccines and autism. But like the prior Institute of Medicine and AHRQ reports, almost certainly the CDC has responded to independent scholarship and an independent scientific report with the conclusions of the McCullough Foundation report on autism. Now, Nick, among the 29 studies that were neutral, that failed to find the association between vaccination and autism, what was wrong with these studies? Why were they not reliable? And why is that a house of cards that's crumbling now for the vaccine industry?
Yeah, we completely exposed those studies and why they cannot be reliably used to actually determine true risk of autism, because not one of them had an actual, truly unvaccinated control group. Not one. They may have claimed it was an unvaccinated control group, but actually, especially with the Danish data set, there was actually about 50-60% of these children were actually vaccinated. And so you cannot properly assess risk if your comparator group has also received the exposure. And so there was that. And then they had what's called misclassification bias. So they didn't verify the vaccine cards. They didn't verify the autism in the children with physical exams. And so it was all based on these ICD codes. And, you could keep going down the list of flaws they had there. A lot of the times they employed certain statistical tricks to lower their associations, and then later reanalyses of the same data sets, particularly Anderson and colleagues that looked at aluminum recently. In the supplementary data sets, there actually are increased risks of neurodevelopmental disorders that the authors simply do not report on. So it was all that bias, and then bias of the publishing cartel that doesn't publish this data, and academic bias where researchers are afraid to lose their jobs if they publish these types of studies. So there's probably many of these studies laying around somewhere in people's drawers, but they never publish them because they're afraid of losing their career. So all those studies were highly flawed. But one thing I want to bring up, and this is important, is the 12 studies that did have an actual unvaccinated control group. All 12 of them found that the unvaccinated were far healthier in every single domain, far less chronic disease, far less autism, most importantly, far less neurodevelopmental disorders of all types, including ADHD, tics, speech delays, speech disorders, and less asthma, autoimmune disease, skin disorders, ear infections, everything you could think of. And so it was quite undeniable.
Well, I certainly think that many have contributed to this field, and recent books have been very helpful. So John mentioned our book, New York Times bestseller, Vaccines, Mythology and Ideology and Reality, which give this context. And we do take it right up into the point of, the court of claims in the case of Hannah Poling and the father, Jonathan Poling. John, what's the impact of these vignettes, these clinical case series where we're carefully told in an individual child what's happened?
Well, I think the most remarkable study, or I should say case study or vignette, is not only in terms of its clinical presentation, but also the way in which the United States government responded to it. It is this very remarkable case of Hannah Poling. Her father, John Poling, was a neurologist at Johns Hopkins University Hospital, a distinguished neurologist. And it just so happened that his young daughter, Hannah, went and received a large battery of vaccines. It is the classic case that we've seen duplicated many times over with other parents and their children. But in this case, it's remarkable because the father, who is observing this in real time, is himself a neurologist. So Hannah goes, she gets a big battery of vaccines. She develops a fever, inconsolable crying, a kind of syndrome of different acute symptoms. The initial symptoms resolve, at which point she regresses into this uncommunicative, withdrawn, impaired state, which was shortly thereafter diagnosed as autism. So Dr. Poling and his colleague, a man named Dr. I believe it's Andrew Simmer, I believe is his name, they do a study, a case study on this. It's published, it's peer reviewed. And then a very strange thing happens during this so-called Autism omnibus proceeding in the U.S. Federal Court of Claims. You have a kind of classing together of about 5,000 different claims of autism, and Dr. Poling is just one of them. And I think it's very important, if you want to understand how this whole story has been handled, or I would say mishandled in the public forum, what you see is once it becomes evident to the U.S. Justice Department defendants in this case that one of the claimants in the autism omnibus proceeding is Dr. Poling, who's not just any parent. He's a Johns Hopkins Medical Center neurologist. What we now know is that the U.S. Department of Justice defending attorneys, they then take Dr. Poling and his wife aside, and they say, look, we're going to acknowledge that in your case, the vaccines did cause Hannah's autism, but we would prefer that this be done as a separate acknowledgement, that in other words, we remove you from the autism omnibus proceedings. Now, if you look at the way this unfolded, it's obviously unfair and fraudulent to the rest of the cases in the omnibus proceeding, because what the court then says is, based on the cases, the test cases we've evaluated, not including HANA polling, we've concluded there is no link between childhood vaccination and autism. So we've taken the HANA polling case. It's just one of many, but it's a very significant example of first showing it is evidence of the link between childhood vaccination and autism. But it's also a very dark and disturbing example of the way the United States government has handled this. And the deeper we got into it, and I would like to mention another dimension of this that pertains to our co-author, Andrew Wakefield. I had heard the lore of Andrew Wakefield, a British gastroenterologist who had just been characterized as a kind of persona non grata in British medicine. His medical license was pulled. He was harassed and dragged through the mud of the media. And so I think, Doctor, you would share my initial perception when we first looked at this. We thought, well, gee whiz, I mean, where there's all this smoke, there must be fire. But when we actually looked at Dr. Wakefield, at his research, at the narrative that he actually encountered as a gastroenterologist, the parents came to him and they said, look, the child has GI tract inflammation and all kinds of problems in GI tract function, but also coincident to that, the child seems to be suffering from autism. So Dr. Wakefield and his colleagues will say, well, what's going on here? This is a rather remarkable observation. They publish a seminal study in The Lancet in the year 1998, and I want to emphasize this. They do not claim to have discovered a link between MMR vaccination and autism. They do not make that claim. They merely say, looking at the case studies that have been presented to us, it strongly raises the suspicion that there's a link and that this should be further examined. And I'll conclude with this. In my opinion, what got Dr. Wakefield in trouble with this public health pharmaceutical company, biopharmaceutical complex, was the particular statement in the Lancet report was, if there is indeed a link between MMR and autism, we can expect to see a strong upward trend in the number of cases of autism in the UK. So that has proven to be prophetic. And I think that statement that he made is a key element of his being branded, in effect, a heretic. Now, we use a lot of scientific language in our discourse about this kind of subject, but I really want to emphasize that the way Wakefield was treated, to me, is very reminiscent of the way the Holy Office of the Inquisition used to treat people who were branded as heretics. People like Galileo Galilei, for example. So this autism story encompasses science, logic, history, religion. It's a vast story, and where it ceases to be just an academic matter is in these tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of children who are profoundly autistic. And Dr. Wow. I'll let you talk a little bit more about this. I think this this idea of a spectrum disorder obscures the fact that this isn't just a spectrum. There is, in fact, on the severe side of the spectrum, a very, very distinct presentation of severe symptoms. Could you talk about that?
Yes, certainly. And, Wakefield will appear on national TV, as many of us will throughout probably today and for, some time now. Many are calling for his exoneration, his vindication, including Senator Ron Johnson today by tweet. Now, remember, Wakefield's initial observation in Lancet was a valid study for 13 years in Lancet before, under pressure from the pharmaceutical lobby, Lancet retracted the paper. But it was only after Wakefield's prediction was beginning to come true. Now, what's happened in the last year is notable. That a book by Gavin de Becker called Brain Injury was published. And de Becker points out that 20 vaccines have in their package inserts a side effect. The side effect is encephalitis or brain inflammation. So through these FDA-negotiated package inserts, the vaccines do cause brain inflammation in some children. I think de Becker's work on this is spot on. The other book, yeah, that's it right there, Forbidden Facts. So a great credit to Gavin de Becker. The other book that hit, in addition to ours, John, is a book by lead attorney Aaron Siri from Siri Gilmstead, and it's called Vaccines, Amen. And it's a reiteration of this observation that vaccines are accepted based on religious faith. And he points out this dark part of vaccine regulation, where the vaccines get approved with very little clinical data, almost nothing on safety, no proven trials where there's a placebo-controlled trial, certainly not enough follow-up, and how corrupt the entire vaccine industry is. So these three books, our book, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality, Gavin de Becker, Brain Injury, and then Aaron Siri, Vaccines, Amen. This was occurring in 2025 before the McCullough Foundation report hits. The CDC comes out with a report that we're now deep into autism. That occurred this spring with the 2025 release of the 2022 data. And now we have this picture of profound autism that John brought up. And I see these individuals in my practice. And I want to make this point that my clinical exam of autistic individuals, young individuals, adolescents, adults, to me, it appears like a post-encephalitic pattern, meaning that there was brain inflammation around the time of the vaccines were being administered, and now there are associated features of encephalitis, a difficulty in concentration, difficulty in maintaining eye contact, communication. There's actually hearing abnormalities. This is common with encephalitis, for instance, where there's what's called hyperacusis. You may see autistic children wearing sound-canceling headphones. That's a post-encephalitic feature. There is about 32% of autistic children also have attention deficit disorder. About 8% of those with ADHD have autism. And then there's a percent, probably 10 to 15% of autistic children, particularly profound autism, that have epilepsy or seizures. These are all consistent, in my view, as autism spectrum disorder, particularly profound autism, being a manifestation of a post-encephalitic state. Because the reason I'm saying this is the CDC has brought up the issue of ingredients. And many have seen exhaustive analyses on mercury, thiomersal, which has largely been removed from the vaccines, save for 4% of the influenza vaccines. So it's out. And, so mercury has been removed from the vaccines and autism still has gone up. We now have aluminum to examine. So about 60% of all the doses of vaccines given to children contain aluminum. And the aluminum amounts that accumulate over time exceed the body's ability to get rid of it. There are case examples where blood aluminum levels have been measured in children, and they are high transiently after a vaccine. But I'm here to tell you that I don't think autism spectrum disorder is a manifestation of aluminum encephalopathy. Aluminum encephalopathy has been described, for sure, in a French study of elderly people called the Plaquid study, and it manifests because there's aluminum in the drinking water for many years in these elderly French community. It's a form of accelerated dementia. It has a physical exam feature of a clonus or myoclonus, which is a ratcheting of the muscles and a certain pattern on reflex, and can be associated with in a sense almost like a delirium. The same would be true from aluminum encephalopathy in hemodialysis patients. So it's my interpretation that the metals, both mercury and aluminum, contribute to brain inflammation or encephalitis, but they themselves are not an etiologic factor or a central factor in the development of autism spectrum disorder. Meaning, like with mercury, removing that from the vaccines did not stop the autism epidemic, and I don't think removing aluminum from the vaccines will stop the autism epidemic because it's global brain inflammation that's inherent to the vaccine ingredients, the main ingredients, which include the antigens or the attenuated viral strains or killed viral strains. So, Nick, what do you see out there in terms of mainstream media and social media reaction to this development from the CDC, which, but by the way, the CDC had no press release on this. This is probably one of the most profound statements the CDC has made about childhood vaccines in many decades, and no press release. Nick, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, well, you read my mind. I was just searching that up, and it's not surprising. We look at every single mainstream media site is lashing out in a panic ever since this happened. For example, let's see here. Where do they mention misinformation? Here we go. CDC website changed to include false claims that link autism to vaccines. CNN. Let's see what else. CDC replaces website on vaccines and autism with false and misleading claims. CDC vaccine website promotes anti-science claims.
So
Yeah.
if I could just interject, what you're seeing, and this is not an exaggeration, that this is not just some vague metaphor. That this is the exact equivalent during the Counter-Reformation of the Holy Office of the Inquisition trying to stamp out heresy. I scanned through some of these stories. None of them address the evidence. It's just a further. It's a reassertion of an orthodox article of faith. This is important. None of these journalists actually examine the arguments or the data. So
it's almost, John, it's almost as if they're making an ad hominem attack directly against the agency.
Well, it is. Now, I have to admit, it shows how naive I am. I thought that the CDC did accompany the website change with a press release. And now you're telling me, because somebody sent me the link. I assumed it was a link to a press release. So in other words, they just kind of by night and fog updated the website, but didn't announce it. Do I understand this correctly?
Well, and there's nobody's name at the end of they issue kind of 9 pages on this. There's no CDC officer or, this is so big, you'd think you'd have, acting CDC director Jim O'Neill. Now, Jim O'Neill did receive the McCullough Foundation report, but this is a stunning development. Now, Nick, what are you seeing on the health freedom side of things out there in social media and in independent media?
Yeah, the health freedom side, they are very happy that even this and it really is kind of really just a small little baby step of changing words on a website. But just this small win has made people so happy because people have been fighting for this for so long, and the medical freedom movement, the grassroots MAHA movement does view this as a major win, and it is. because they are finally reversing their stance on the vaccines and autism.
Mm.
But yeah, we do need to see a press conference, that's for sure.
Well,
You know, it's
well,
quite
but-
strange
well,
to just roll out such a large change and not give any explanation.
Well, in many ways, this is the McCullough Foundation press conference. We did issue a press release on our report October 27, 2025. John, I want to finish with your reflections about the role of public activism out there. The CDC does mention in its website report yesterday that at least half of parents surveyed with children with autism believe the vaccines played a role in the development of autism. Many of these parents have become activists, and we've seen the rise of just, wonderful health activist organizations out there, and their impetus has become greater and greater. What do you think their role is in seeing the change that we just saw over the last 24 hours?
Well, I think it's the most perfidious feature of this story is the story, and Dr. Wakefield, has emphasized this repeatedly in conversations with me. He says, look, it's an old adage of medicine that you have to actually listen to patients. You can't just say, patient comes into my office complaining of something, but what the hell does he know? He's an idiot and he didn't go to medical school. I mean, you're not going to get very far actually as a healer if that's your arrogant academic attitude. But it's funny, I didn't fully appreciate this. In the case of an infant, the infant oftentimes has not reached the stage where the infant can speak. So what the physician has to do is ask the mother, particularly the mother, because during this early phase of life, the mother has an incredibly close relationship with her infant. In fact, I would dare say, not that I know anything about it personally, but that a mother's relationship with her infant is probably the most exquisitely tuned relationship in all of human relations. I mean, she's constantly looking at him and his face and his affect and his tone and all of the stuff that infants signal. So it's the height of perfidious arrogance when a mom comes in and says, look, the baby was fine. First 12 months, first 18 months, he was a sort of a babbling toddler that was playing with toys and would hold eye contact and smile at me when I smiled at him. The vignette, and there are thousands of them, mom takes the baby in for a baby well visit. Baby gets a bunch of shots. 12 hours later, the baby develops a high fever, sometimes all the way up to 105 Fahrenheit. Maybe has a seizure. I've had numerous parents tell me the terrifying thing was shortly after vaccination, we were in a restaurant. The baby was in one of those little carrying things. And we look over and the baby is seizing. Oh my God, what's going on here? The seizures or the fever or the combination of both resolve, at which point the baby regresses. It's like someone just kidnapped the child, leaving behind a kind of empty husk of the child. The mom goes in, she's got the temporal association clearly documented. And what does the pediatrician as often as not tell her? It has nothing to do with the vaccines. So, I mean, if a criminal investigator told that to parents whose child had disappeared, and the parents had a document, the child went to the bus stop to get on the school bus and was last seen, was never seen again. If the investigator said, something, I appreciate this is your perception of the timeline, but I don't think that's the case. I mean, no crime would ever be solved. So I really think it's important to understand that this is the kind of debate in human affairs that can be easily seized by people availing themselves of academic authority in order to, in effect, appropriate the conversation away from the actual witnesses. And in this case, the most important witnesses are the mothers. So we've seen with some of the mothers that we've worked with, Jackie Schlegel here in Texas, there are a number of women mothers who have worked closely with Children's Health Defense. I mean, they're really the bottom of the basis. Their witness testimony is the basis of ultimately arriving at seeing the reality of what's going on here.
Well, great credit given to these mothers and fathers who have joined organizations, been major drivers in organizations. So in Texas, Jackie Schlegel for Texas for Medical Freedom, Rebecca Hardy, Texans for Vaccine Choice, Children's Health Defense, you mentioned, led by Mary Holland, now an organization that's essentially changed the landscape of vaccine risk awareness. They've made huge strides. Del Bigtree and the High Wire, one of the best media presentations you can ever have on the topic. And of course, Del's documentaries of Vaxxed, Unvaxxed, and now An Inconvenient Study, which won a Best Film Award at the Malibu Independent Film Festival. Syria and Gilmstad and its not-for-profit agency, I Can Decide. They've been enormously influential. Canadians for Vaccine Choice and all the international organizations, the World Council for Health, great credit since their guidance came out on called Safer to Wait in 2023. That was the physician-led, evidence-based, consensus-driven organization, the first one to come out and say, listen, maybe it's safer to wait, or it is safer to wait on childhood vaccines. So great credit given to all of those who have worked to change the landscape of where we are in vaccines, and now the CDC essentially capitulating to some degree. Now they have indicated they will have their own report, and they should. And I imagine the McCullough Foundation report will be a great report to build on. There's a wonderful report published by Toby Rogers of the Brownstone Institute that has a huge building block of information on the genetic determinants or the susceptibility factors for autism. All of these will come together. But I'm here to tell you, I think today is a day in history where vaccination in the United States and worldwide forever has changed. We saw a report by Vasuvian and colleagues published in JAMA Open Network recently where 60% of parents indicate they're not going through with the full ACIP schedule as it's laid out before them. Some may be delayed or declined. Some may opt out of vaccination altogether. We include in our report a paper by Mawson and Jacob indicating that 10% of all Medicaid recipients in Florida now, those children have had no Medicaid visits for vaccination. Maybe their parents may be declining vaccination altogether. And as Nick Hulscher indicates in our report, 12 studies reassuringly have indicated that if a healthy child born today goes without any vaccines, that they are indeed healthier than their fully vaccinated counterparts. And we have treatments for these vaccine-preventable diseases now, the mortality of which all were substantially reduced long before the vaccines have ever came onto the market and got into popular use. So, Nick, we're going to close out this live broadcast from the McCullough Foundation at this time. But I want you to update our followers about where they can see this broadcast and where they can see our coverage on this late-breaking development from the CDC. It's first in history acknowledgement that childhood vaccination may be linked to autism. So, Nick, take it from here and close this out.
Gentlemen, could I just interject something real quick?
Yes.
We have 2 minutes. I just wanted to say, if I may, Doctor, what I think is the best way to proceed in terms of investigating and further drilling down on this, if I may. So I think that going forward, the approach to this, the methodology, should be what Sir Austin Bradford Hill did in his examination of, is there a link between smoking over a period of time and lung cancer? And I think it's instructive. Sir Austin Bradford Hill did not set out to ascertain the causes of the whole spectrum of different kinds of cancer. There was an observation that had already been made. There had been some seminal observations made in Germany in the 20s and 30s. There was a guy named Fritz Linkett in Germany who did an epidemiological study on smoking and lung cancer. What Sir Austin did is he said, we are going to try to ascertain if not the entire population, but in what is apparently a susceptible segment of the population, for whatever underlying reasons, if heavy smoking causes lung cancer. And so he very carefully and methodically examined this, and he ultimately drew the conclusion there is a causal link between smoking and lung cancer. And that is what needs to be done with autism. There needs to be a properly structured case series of parents who have reported this particular vignette: normal birth, normal gestation, normal milestone, developmental milestones hit, goes in to get a bunch of vaccines. It's these multiple administrations all at once, develops the initial acute symptoms, and then regresses into autism. A Bradford Hill style study needs to be done on this, and then that will show the way, just as Sir Austin showed the way with smoking and lung cancer.
And John, to qualify that, our next steps at McCullough Foundation specifically to focus on the subset of profound autism, which is unambiguous. So we don't have the clouded array of spectrum diagnoses that is referred to as neurodiversity. We want to focus on those that were completely normal and they've become severely impaired after a battery of vaccines.
Yes, I think that's important. I see autism spectrum disorder as a deliberate muddying of the semantic waters. And I interviewed Gavin DeBecker about his book, and I do want to get the title right, Forbidden Facts. And he independently of me had the exact same perception. This talk of a spectrum is what it's doing is it's diverting attention from identifying a particular symptom that's caused by a particular cause. It's making the whole thing so broad and ill-defined that you can't actually hit a particular target.
Well, in other words, John, it's normalizing it. Like, this is normal, and it's being presented to the public as neurodiversity. Nick, we've got to close it out. Tell our followers where they can find the McCullough Foundation report, how to follow us, how to support the McCullough Foundation in our critical work in this area, which is clearly influencing public policy acutely. Again, McCullough Foundation report released October 27th, 2025, sent to the CDC, HHS, all of the officials, November 19th, 2025. The CDC comes out after reviewing that with now, I think, a clear capitulation that we can no longer say that childhood vaccination is unrelated to autism. Nick, take it away.
Yeah, so everybody go visit McCulloughFND.org. You will find our autism report on our homepage. You'll find the link. There's a Noto link where you can download the whole report. We're going to follow up with this interview on thefocalpoints.com. We're going to post it on our Substack if you want to rewatch it, and we're going to provide all the links and the breakdown of everything that's happened. And yeah, I just want to close out with, this is a very serious situation. Look at the top right. Look at that graph. We went from 1 in 10,000. We're now at 1 in 31. 26.7% of these are profoundly autistic children. So we cannot just not do anything and let this to continue to increase until half of all boys will end up being autistic at its current trajectory. So again, very serious. 107 studies we identified, all linking vaccines to autism or neurodevelopmental disorders, spanning epidemiologic population data down to mechanistic biological evidence, down to clinical and real case reports. So the preliminary evidence is so clear. Now we're honing in on the final steps. And if you want to support us in those final steps, please consider contributing to the McCullough Foundation, again, at mcculloughfnd.org.
Nick and John, thank you so much. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, president of the McCullough Foundation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.